All right, welcome back, or just welcome if this is your first time with us here. We're going to continue our discussion of human resources and focus right now on selection. And so just to kind of bring you up to speed for what we've gone over before, we focused on the planning function, so identifying what the jobs are and what we need them to do, right? Doing a job analysis, conducting or developing a job description, the job specification, right? Figuring out what the jobs entail. We've done a little bit of recruitment, and so we've determined how we're going to get people to apply for our organization. We focused either on internal or external recruitment methods, maybe a combination of the two. And now we're going to move on to selection. And so what we assume now is that we have already had people applying for certain positions. We have what we call an applicant pool. And so we have a large number of people, hopefully, that have applied for our position. And now what we need to do is we need to figure out who out of the bunch is really any good, right? We really need to figure out who is the most likely out of this group of people, whoever it is, that's going to be a high-performing applicant. And so we have a group of people in here, and ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to whittle them down and ultimately get a handful of people. And so we're getting a smaller number, right? A little more refined. And ultimately what we do with the selection process is we enact hurdles. And so with every stage of the selection process, we're trying to reduce the number of people that are in the applicant pool. And so every time we continue along that path, we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller until at the very end we have a few people, and then we make a decision who is going to be the best candidate. Who do we feel is the best fit for the organization, can do the job the most effectively, right, is the best fit overall. And so that's what the selection process entails, is ultimately taking a large group of people and then ultimately enacting these barriers so that each stage some people are getting weeded out of the process that aren't a natural fit. And so there's a number of obstacles, hurdles, barriers, whatever you want to call them, that employers will throw up as a way of getting people out of the organization. So the first thing you see when you apply is you usually have to fill out some type of application. Right? Usually you can't get around this. Sometimes they're paper copies. A lot of times now they're completely online, so it's automated. So now that we have computers that pull certain pieces of information and we can filter, makes things a lot easier than just reviewing applications, paper copies. I know it's very tedious, very time consuming. So the application is good because what it allows the employer to do is it allows them to obtain very, very basic information about a candidate. And so you're going to get information like name, right? You're going to get some address information and phone numbers and different things. You're going to get probably education. You're probably going to get experience, maybe some references, but it's pretty basic. It's very general. It's going to look the same. You can't really develop a great deal of inferences or conclusions. You can't draw a great deal of conclusions based simply on an application, right? I mean, they all are the same for the most part. It's very, very basic information. So what you can typically do with the application is really just focus on things like education and experience and kind of go from there usually. And what you're doing in the review process is just trying to make sure and see if people meet certain minimum qualifications, right? You have the minimum level of experience that we need, the minimum level of education we need. Let's move them on to the next round. And that can look a number of different ways, right? Sometimes employers go right to interviews, but sometimes, and they make things a little more interesting, employers can incorporate what we refer to as employment tests. And some of you may have seen these if you've applied for different positions. They're not utilized for all positions, but typically some of the mid, maybe higher level positions that require a lot of training and there's a big investment, right? Employers want to make sure that they're going to get some type of return, and that if they're going to put a lot of money into you in terms of training and development costs and those different things, that you're the right person to make that investment. And so employment tests can look like a number of different things, right? You have simple aptitude tests, which just demonstrate if you have certain skills. You can do work samples, which are actually very effective. So let's say you're interviewing for a position as a administrative assistant. For me to get a feel for if you're administrative assistant, I'm not going to ask you a bunch of questions. Maybe I'll give you a scenario and have you perform functions just like an administrative assistant would on the job for an hour or so. I'll observe your behavior, I'll observe your performance, I'll kind of, the scenarios I give you, I kind of want done a certain way, and so I'm going to basically score you on your performance because that's basically a realistic job preview, right? That's what you're going to be doing on the job, and so the argument is if you can't do it in this environment, then you're probably not going to do it when you're actually on the job. And so those are generally really effective. Work samples are pretty expensive though, and they do take some time, which is why some employers shy away from them because it is a big investment, but they do yield very effective results. Another thing you can do are cognitive ability tests, and this is under the umbrella of employment tests, of course. And I really am a fan of cognitive ability tests for a number of different reasons. The primary one, though, is that according to research, the greatest link between performance on the job is intelligence or general mental ability, meaning that the more intelligent or the higher the IQ you are, the more likely you're going to perform better on the job. Now, it's not always the case, obviously, because if people are lazy, then that's going to screw everything up. But generally speaking, if you're more intelligent, what that does is that allows you to learn complex tasks more quickly than anyone else. And so if you have very complex jobs, the argument is I want someone that's more intelligent because they have the mental capacity to learn those more quickly and perform them more effectively and more regularly with a certain level of accuracy. And so a lot of companies, they utilize what we call or what is known as a Wonderlic test. It's a great test. It's 50 questions, all multiple choice. And the exam, or the test, you get 12 minutes to take. And no one ever finishes it. I think there's maybe a few instances where anyone's ever finished, but other than that, it's very, very difficult to do so. So you get 12 minutes, you get 50 questions, and you solve as many as you can. You have to go in order. You can't skip any. And the questions start out, and they're really easy, and it's almost deceiving, right? I've taken like 3 or 4, and so you answer the first couple, and you're like, man, they're just so easy. I'm doing so great. But gradually, as you progress, they get more difficult. And so the importance of it is there's a mathematical formula based upon how many you solve to get ultimately what your level of IQ is. And so a lot of employers, what they do is they have a bar set. So you have to get 22 right on a Wonderlic exam, for example. Otherwise, we screen you out. You don't move on to the next step of the process. And I've actually worked for employers where they had a Wonderlic test. They had a certain benchmark. And if you did not get higher than that, then you didn't move on to an interview. You didn't even get to talk to anybody at all. It was really, take this exam. If you do well, then maybe we'll move you on to the next step. So that's a very effective way of doing it, obviously, is because those are generally pretty cost effective. They're pretty inexpensive to do, right? And so you really just set someone up with a computer and they answer questions, and then you're pretty much good to go. Assuming they get past any type of employment test that we do, right? You can also do physical ability tests, right? So if I'm hiring for construction, for example, if I need something built, I'm not going to ask you questions on, how to build certain things. I'm going to say, okay, well, why don't you build this for me real quick, and I'll gauge your performance and see how you did. Because I want to see ultimately what your work is like, right? I don't want you to describe it to me because we generally exaggerate a little bit. I want you to do it because that's going to yield more effective results. Now, once I've finished through that, what you can also do and what you generally see is employers also incorporate some type of personal interview, right? Generally face-to-face. And interviews are generally structured, meaning that there's a set list of questions that are asked to every applicant, right? Every person applying gets asked the same questions. And the reason that employers do that is because we need to have some way of measuring performance for different applicants, right? If I ask everybody a different set of questions, then I have no way of grading and seeing, okay, well, candidate A was better than candidate B. Well, I don't really know. I asked them different questions. And so that's why most employers follow a structured interview format. The other reason is it prevents the interviewer from asking potentially illegal questions like age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, anything like that can be a red flag, because you don't want them making up their own questions and going a little bit off the handle. So if you have a list of structured questions, you ensure that they go based upon your pre-approved questions that have already been screened by someone in HR. Now, one trade-off that you get to with regards to interviews is that the effectiveness of them is dependent upon the interviewer. And what I mean by that is a lot of biases get introduced with interviewers, and even if there's been research that's been done, and even when we're aware of them, we still tend to introduce other biases in there. So I don't want to go into these very, very much, but just as an example, there are things called like the halo effect or the horns effect, and you may have heard of these before. And so if I'm interviewing someone and I find out they have some type of quality that I like, right? Maybe they went to the same school I did, or maybe they are charismatic and I like that about people, or whatever the case. The point is, I find one quality that I really, really like, and then I focus on that the entire time. And what that does is it affects the way that I assess other questions, right? I'm automatically looking for the positive in everything that they say, and I'm losing my objectivity. In contrast to that, the horns effect is when I find some quality that I just don't like, right? I very strongly dislike some type of quality, whether it's maybe a certain type of cologne that person has on, maybe it's a certain type of dress, whatever it is. Maybe they show up in not appropriate attire. And so I've completely written them off, and now I'm looking for things that support my belief that they aren't a good applicant, right? So I'm being very critical, maybe overly critical, and obviously not consistent with how I rate other people. And so those are the issues with interviews and how we introduce other biases depending upon ultimately what's important to us. And a lot of times we do them and we don't even tend to, right? It's not intentional, but we just automatically default to them. So these are some of the common selection tools. And remember, when I mentioned this before, is that the whole idea here is we're trying to key in on who's a qualified worker, right? Out of this large body of people, how are we going to whittle them down to a handful of people where we can make a decision who's the most likely to be a high-performing applicant? And you can do a lot more different things than just what I've identified. These are some of the more common things. There's been some really interesting things done by places like Google, for example, right? Google is notoriously known for having a very, very difficult selection process, right? They have many steps. They have phone interviews, and then different types of aptitude tests, and then face-to-face interviews, and they ask you all these types of crazy questions like, if you were the size of a penny and you were in a blender and the blender was about to start, what would you do? And so they're trying to gauge your ability to think critically based upon that situation, and also if you ask questions and different things and try and zero in on an actual answer, right? There was also, a lot of times Larry Page, who's the CEO of Google, would simply ask the actual interviewee to teach them something, right? Anything, whatever subject that you know best, teach it to me. I'm going to go get a cup of coffee and I'll be right back, and I want you to teach me something. And so his rationale was, one, that's pretty uncommon, right? No one ever does that. And so you kind of put the applicant or the interviewee kind of in a state of shock almost, right? You're kind of just, wow, I didn't realize that anyone ever asked that. And so you're putting them off guard a little bit and trying to see how they react, right? If they can think through the thing. But also his rationale was, well, if the interview went completely horrible and I didn't actually choose them, or they bombed, whatever the case was, at least I learned something, right? So always looking for the positive is a good thing. So those are some of the selection tools. Hopefully that helps give you some clarification on that with regards to some of the options employers have.